In 1979, Ridley Scott's Alien released and immediately proved to be a commercial success. While 20th Century Fox initially believed the success to be a fluke, they eventually were made to finance a sequel. In 1986, James Cameron directed this sequel, entitled Aliens, which ended up becoming an even greater commercial success than the first, and it proved that Alien had franchise potential. Aiming to capitalize on this potential, 6 years later in 1992, Alien 3 would be released. Nowadays, both Alien and Aliens are regarded as classics in their respective genres. They had a profound influence on science fiction and cinema as a whole. However, whenever there's a discussion about the greatest film trilogies ever made, Alien is never brought up. Of course, every trilogy has its weakest link, but the discourse surrounding Alien 3 goes beyond that. Many fans of the first two movies either never bothered with Alien 3 or they hate it. There are some Alien 3 apologists, but even then, no one claims it holds a candle to the first two entries. While the Alien franchise has persevered over the last few decades, many believe it never recovered from this sharp decline in quality. Over the past 2 weeks, I've taken a look at both the first and second Alien movies, both of which I loved. However, being a fan of David Fincher, I was well aware of Alien 3's reputation. With the director as acclaimed as Fincher at the helm though, could Alien 3 really be as bad as some say? And how did Alien 3 even earn this reputation? After the release of the first Alien, Brandywine Productions immediately wanted to get to work on a sequel. However, Fox disagreed. As was previously mentioned, they thought its success was a fluke. After the second film, Aliens, shared similar success though, they realized the potential of Alien as a franchise. This time, Fox wanted to get to work on another Alien film as soon as possible, but Brandywine Productions were a bit apprehensive. Still, they weren't against the idea. Had they known beforehand just what this production would entail, I doubt they would have agreed to make this third entry though. Producers David Giler and Walter Hill had come up with a story that would be told across two films. In the third entry, Hicks would take a leading role, with Ripley returning merely as a cameo. Then in the fourth installment, Ripley would return as the series protagonist. Although Fox was skeptical, they greenlit the production and asked for Ridley Scott to return to direct both films. Scott was apparently already tied up with other obligations however, and so the search began for both a scriptwriter and director. This long and troubled production officially began in September of 1987, when David Giler and Walter Hill approached cyberpunk author William Gibson to write the script for Alien 3. His completed script seemed to be what Giler and Hill were looking for, but for one reason or another, they weren't satisfied with it. They asked Gibson to make some rewrites, to which he simply decided to leave the project altogether. Eventually, this script was turned into a comic series though, so if you're curious, it is widely available. Next up to bat was Eric Red. After only 2 months, he submitted a completed script that neither he nor the studio liked. He left the project soon after, and it was this experience that had Brandywine drop the idea of developing 2 films at once. After that short experiment, David Twohy was brought on to write the Alien 3 script, and he was the one who finally placed the story on a prison planet, which is an element that remained into the finished product. One thing all these scripts had in common up to this point was that they sidelined Ripley in favor of Hicks. Once Twohy's script was submitted though, Fox decided that it would be better if Ripley remained the series protagonist. And in case you were wondering why it took 6 years for Alien 3 to come out when Brandywine apparently got to work soon after Alien's release, it should be a bit more obvious now. It took years for Alien 3 to finally take shape into what we know today. As far as this story goes, we're now in mid to late 1989, and there still isn't even a draft of the script completed, let alone a director attached to the project. That would all seem to change though, as Vincent Ward was brought on to direct Alien 3, and he brought an all-new story with him. Ward brought on a lot of ideas that would be used in the finished script, like an all-male religious group, Ripley being infected, and eventually sacrificing herself in the end. Naturally, Fox was against the idea of having their franchise protagonist die at the end, but Sigourney Weaver was persistent, claiming that she'd only do the movie if the ending remained. Still, despite having Weaver's support and introducing many inspired concepts to the project, Fox was yet again dissatisfied with this script. They called a meeting giving Ward a list of changes that needed to be made, and following Ward's refusal, he was subsequently fired. Seeing as Ward's firing was an unexpected development, filming was soon set to begin, and Brandywine still didn't have a completed script. Scrambling, producers Walter Hill and David Giler took scriptwriting duties upon themselves. Taking bits and pieces from the various scripts they had received, they were able to put together a somewhat coherent story. Also scrambling to find a director, they eventually hired David Fincher, known then only for his credits as a music video director. And this would prove to be a diamond in the rough for this production, as David Fincher would go on to become one of the most critically acclaimed directors of his generation. Despite Hill and Giler's best efforts though, filming began without a script. David Fincher immediately made his presence known however, and made some changes to the script. One of his most notable changes was the idea that the alien would be more similar to a beast than a humanoid for this entry. He even contacted H.R. Giger to come up with some new designs, with one of these designs being used in the film. Now, from a design perspective, I think the alien looks really good in this movie. It's in line with what we've seen previously, and Alien 3 ends up having some of my favorite shots we've gotten of a xenomorph up to this point, like this one where it confronts Ripley, and when it stares down from the ceiling at Gallic. Despite the design being good though, overall the alien looks terrible, and this comes down to the visual effects themselves. David Fincher wanted the alien to move faster than it had in either of the previous films. This wouldn't seem possible with the current methods of either puppeteering or putting someone in a costume. That doesn't mean they didn't try though, with the crew at one point attempting to put a dog in a xenomorph costume. Eventually they settled on what I thought was CG at first. However, upon further research, they did in fact use puppeteering and costumes to accomplish the effects in Alien 3. To do this, the crew filmed both the costumed actor and rod puppet against the blue screen, and then composited these shots into the live action footage. This is conceptually impressive, but unfortunately, the end result just looks bad. The fault mostly falls on the compositing, I think. There's an ugly green glow on the alien in most scenes in the dark, which account for a majority of its screen time. Because of this, aside from close-ups, the alien never has the presence it did in either of the previous entries. The alien wasn't the only blue screen effect used in Alien 3 though. Blue screens were also used for any scene featuring a ship either in space or in the atmosphere of Fury 161, and these shots look equally as off-putting. It's genuinely unbelievable to me that Brandywine got this right in the original Alien, and somehow went on to mess it up 13 years later. And considering just how bad these shots look, I'm shocked they made it into the finished film. While every aspect of Alien 3's production may have seemed to be rushed, one thing that wasn't rushed was the score. The score for Alien 3 is genuinely incredible. It's definitely my favorite in the series so far. And this soundtrack hits you before the Fox fanfare even concludes. The fanfare is ominously extended, immediately setting the tone for Alien 3. I do have one complaint with the score though, and I'm assuming this might be a hot take. But the rock song that plays while Ripley is attacked feels so out of place. I mean, the scene as a whole feels out of place, but this track definitely doesn't help with that. Aside from that minor misstep though, the score for Alien 3 might be my favorite part of the film, which unfortunately isn't saying much. Upon release, Alien 3 was panned by critics and fans alike. Notably, James Cameron and Michael Biehn came forward, openly criticizing the narrative. Why did Alien 3 elicit such strong reactions? Well, there are plenty of problems with the story, but none are as prevalent as the asinine decision to kill off both Hicks and Newt off-screen in the opening minutes of the narrative. Immediately, this alienates any and all fans of the most popular film in your franchise thus far. In effect, saying to the audience, you know that movie that you all loved? All those great characters and the themes of motherhood and overcoming trauma? Yet none of that mattered. James Cameron described it as a slap in the face to both himself and the fans, and I couldn't agree more. Don't get me wrong, I understand the logistical concerns of bringing back those characters, but surely there was a more elegant solution than killing them off in the most tragic way possible. This decision just feels painfully misguided and, simply put, disrespectful. It was also disrespectful to Michael Biehn, who only found out that his character was unceremoniously killed off because a friend of his saw a life-size dummy of his mangled corpse lying around at Pinewood Studios. He did end up getting paid nearly as much money as he made for all of Aliens because of this. But still, it's genuinely insane that after years of deliberation and turning down several scripts, Giler and Hill somehow managed to come up with the most controversial idea possible. Now, just because Alien 3 made one completely backwards decision doesn't mean that it's a bad movie off the bat. A simple synopsis of the premise may make it sound salvageable. The concept of Ripley being trapped on a prison planet with no weapons of any kind calls back to the series' roots, and feels more like a sequel to the original Alien than the second entry did. But in execution, Alien 3 doesn't really do anything interesting with this idea either. There are some okay sequences, but most, like the ending set piece with the maze, end up being long, boring, difficult to follow, and painful to look at due to the unfinished visual effects. I also mentioned in my Alien review how, because of the relatability of the characters, each death has an impact. Aliens lost this a bit with the Marines, but it was still present. Gorman, Vasquez, and especially Hudson's deaths still resonated with audiences. That relatability, and frankly likability, has been completely lost with Alien 3. These characters are not only prisoners, but they've also committed some of the worst crimes imaginable. That, combined with most of them looking alike due to their shaved heads, makes it nearly impossible for me to care about any of these characters. Aside from 85 and Dylan, who did win me over in the end. The biggest reason I struggle to care for any of these characters, though, is simply because of how many there are and how little time is devoted to them. This problem is somewhat alleviated, however, in the so-called assembly cut of Alien 3. Released in 2003, in effect, it's a director's cut. Since David Fincher had no involvement with it though, that name couldn't be used. It was apparently based on Fincher's editing room notes though. It would have been possible to know whether or not this version falls closer in line with Fincher's original vision though, as he refuses to watch it even today. Either way, with an additional 30 minutes of runtime, many deleted scenes added back in, and entirely new plot elements, the assembly cut aims to turn a bad film into a somewhat mediocre one, and I think it succeeds in that endeavor. The longer opening sequence gives the audience time to digest the deaths of both Newt and Hicks, and to get accustomed to the world of Fury 161. It still isn't enough, but it's definitely better. An added scenes of the prisoners simply talking and praying together gives me at least something of a reason to care about whether these people survive. There are two major plot differences present in the assembly cut of Alien 3 though. Firstly, where the alien came from. In the original, it came from one of the prisoners' dogs, which explains its appearance. In the assembly cut though, it came from a dead ox, which not only doesn't make sense, but also doesn't explain why the alien moves like a dog. This is one of the only bad changes the assembly cut made in my opinion, and unfortunately it's a pretty big one. The best change the assembly cut made though is the sequence where the prisoners attempt to capture the alien. In the theatrical release, they spend a lot of time planning to capture it, however in the end they fail. This whole sequence feels incredibly rushed and seems to end just as it's getting started. In the assembly cut, they actually succeed in trapping it, however it's then released by Golic, who has lots more screen time in this version. This is a great change in my opinion. Giving Ripley and the prisoners a win breaks up the bleakness of the narrative, which was frankly getting monotonous by this point, and it also emphasizes the theme of redemption present in this story. One of the prisoners who assaulted Ripley earlier in the narrative actually ends up being the one to sacrifice himself to capture the alien. While he does die as a result, this moment still serves to humanize the prisoners as a collective and makes them more likable. Speaking of Ripley though, her characterization proved to be one of the more frustrating parts of Alien 3. In Aliens, it's established that the reason Ripley was so determined to save Newt was partially because of her guilt over losing her own daughter. It re-emphasized that theme of overcoming trauma. Seeing as she saw her own daughter in Newt, she gets over Newt's death way too quickly in Alien 3 in my opinion. Once Newt is dropped into the furnace, she's never brought up again. That scene was pretty cool though. The funeral coinciding with the birth of the alien combined with the grandiose soundtrack made for an intensely memorable sequence. Back to Ripley, I also question a lot of her decision making in Alien 3. I don't understand why she hesitates to tell Clemens about the alien. She later says that he wouldn't believe her if he told her, but that still is no excuse not to tell him about a potentially life-threatening monster. And in the end, he dies because of her decision, and she doesn't seem to feel an ounce of guilt over it. Keep in mind, this is the person whose top priority seems to be protecting people no matter the cost in the previous two films. Despite these questionable decisions though, which are all toward the beginning of the film, she proves to be her usual self throughout the rest of it. That ever-present theme of corporate greed is yet again a major part of the narrative, and Ripley responds in the same way she always has, willing to sacrifice anything for the sake of protecting innocent people, with this culminating in her sacrificing her own life. And I genuinely love this idea. So long as you're going to abandon the idea of Ripley overcoming her trauma and finding happiness in her life despite all she's been through, the only possible ending for this story was Ripley's death. The only way that could have been accomplished in a satisfying way was with her death being a sacrifice, and the most logical reason to have her do this is to finally have her worst fears come true. The twist that Ripley is carrying an alien queen all throughout the story was genuinely a great idea, and it's one of the few things executed well in Alien 3. It's foreshadowed in an interesting way, and the tension it adds to every bit of the narrative once it's discovered is incredible. Since we all can assume how this story is going to end, the incredibly boring final act still somehow manages to hold the audience's attention. The third act actually isn't all bad though. I actually quite like the way the alien was defeated. The alien surviving the lead was to be expected, since a false victory is a staple of the Alien franchise by this point. Ripley then using the sprinklers though was foreshadowed during the sequence where the prisoners try to trap the alien. When the sprinklers are triggered, there's a shot of a bucket cracking after being rapidly cooled by the water. That shot did stick out to me, but I definitely didn't expect it to pay off in the climax of the narrative. And after this truly triumphant victory is Ripley's sacrifice, which is another excellent moment in this final act. In my opinion, this is another scene that's better in the theatrical release though. The biggest change is that in the theatrical release, the alien bursts from Ripley's chest as she falls, whereas in the assembly cut, she simply falls into the furnace. Conceptually, I'm fine with either of these shots. What I'm not fine with is the execution of the assembly cut. It looks terrible, and it completely took me out of the scene, which is a shame since it should be the climax of a trilogy. And it's even more of a shame that it didn't deliver visually, because the soundtrack, as always, completes the entire scene. Still, it is a great moment, and I love how the shot creates a parallel between Ripley's sacrifice and Newt's funeral. It fits this tragic version of Ripley well, and was realistically the only way Alien 3 could have ended. My first thought when the credits began to roll on Alien 3 was, I should have appreciated Aliens more. Even the tagline for Alien 3 is the worst in the series. Whereas Alien had perhaps the most iconic tagline in film history with, "In space no one can hear you scream," and Aliens had the likewise iconic, "This time it's war." Alien 3 has 3 times the suspense, 3 times the danger, 3 times the terror, which doesn't hold a candle to the prior two. And as widely hated as Alien 3 is, David Fincher has gone on record stating that no one hates Alien 3 more than him. And honestly, that's understandable. As he's proven time and time again, he was capable of much more than what we got in Alien 3. That's not to say the film is irredeemable though. The cinematography was really good for the most part. The soundtrack was amazing, as I've stated, and there is some really good dialogue here. I actually found Alien 3 surprisingly funny. Ripley was also already one of my favorite film characters, and for the most part, she's just as likable here, aside from her questionable decision making in the first act. Still, all that wasn't quite enough to make up for just how disappointing this movie was to me. From what I've heard from Alien fans though, this one tends to grow on people over time, so whether that will be the case with me remains to be seen. But as of now, I found Alien 3 to be a massive disappointment. Despite Alien 3 being poorly received by audiences though, David Fincher's talent was evident to all. The cast and crew had nothing but praise for him, and it seemed clear where his career would be headed. The Alien franchise would move on without him though. 5 years later in 1997, Alien Resurrection released. And while Alien 3 seems to have somewhat grown on people over time, the same cannot be said of Resurrection. So unfortunately, that's what we'll be taking a look at next week. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this.